like to do the roll call.
Here. Here.
Here. Sorry. Here.
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 District 65, Cohen.
Here.
Hilpern.
Here.
Chow.
Here.
Tanya Moody.
Here.
Hernandez.
Here.
Partha.
Here. Okay, we will start off with board and superintendent comments. I'll start off with our 202 colleagues. Are there any board comments that anyone would like to share?
I'll start. I just want to say thank you for having us, and thank you for hosting us, and providing such a nice place for us to have our meeting prior to this. And I look forward to this night. I think we have a full agenda. I like the, as we've been working together and collaborating on our agenda, and I feel like our collaboration is certainly at a high, so I'm really pleased about that. And we have some really good topics and items to talk about tonight, and I'm looking forward to input from everybody. So thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you. And Dr. Witherspoon?
Well, I just want to thank you for hosting, and it's getting to be a pretty regular thing here because our team and Dr. Gorin's team are collaborating regularly, and we alternate back and forth. You know, sometimes we're over here, sometimes they come over our direction, but it has just been, I think, really fruitful for us to be working together the way we are. And I think tonight's agenda represents that. You're going to see some of the collaborative efforts that we, the two districts have going on, and the way that we're even looking at data together so that we can really be more strategic in the work that we do all the way K through 12.
Thank you. And I'll turn to 65 board members. Are there any comments that anyone would like to share? I have some comments that I would like to share. And again, I agree that this collaboration is always exciting, and I enjoy seeing the work that we are moving forward together on. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some opportunities that we've had today, in particular, to hear from parents and community members about concerns and feedback they have around District 65 issues. The first thing is Joey and I this morning hosted the first of a series of board community cafes. And despite the messy weather, we had a pretty good turnout with parents raising questions and offering some really insightful feedback about what currently is happening in the district or things that they believe should be happening. So it was a good discussion, and I am hopeful that this will continue to be a good way for our board to hear from constituents. And we will have additional community cafes every other month scheduled at different times and different locations. So keep an eye out for those announcements. There was also a press conference this morning hosted by community advocacy group Opal around Black student achievement and the need for urgency in District 65 around reducing the still glaring gap in the opportunity to achieve. This morning, when I woke up and as I was having my coffee and reading the news, I read a headline from the Southern Poverty Law Center that read, quote, 54 years ago today, more than 200,000 Chicago children boycotted school to protest educational segregation and inequality. Today, the march continues for all children to have equal opportunities to reach their full potential, end quote. I think we are extraordinarily lucky in our community to have an organization like Opal that continues to advocate for all of our children to have equal opportunities to reach their full potential. Advocacy groups like Opal are a necessary component to a healthy democracy and to strong institutions, and I am grateful for the ways that Opal's advocacy has pushed us to keep Black student achievement and equity at the forefront. I also think we are lucky in our community to have educators, like the more than 40 District 65 educators who attended last week's conference in Detroit, and the hundreds more who have trained in Beyond Diversity and or SEED, all who are deeply committed to exploring their racial identities and how it has shaped them and informed their biases. These educators are deeply committed to continuing their equity training and to work together to translate that training into more equitable learning experiences for their students. I also think we are extraordinarily lucky in this community to have 2 school boards and 2 administrations that are committed to leading the way for this work to happen. I am excited that about the work that we've done to model and refine an equity lens as we approach, in our approach to decision making. And I'm excited in a couple of weeks at our next District 65 board meeting, when we're going to get to hear in more detail about the administration's work around tying our equity agenda into the work of our strategic plan. So even though, as I approach with excitement all of this work that we are doing and are going to be continuing to do, I know that there is still much, much work ahead to do, that the data very clearly shows us that our institution is not serving all of our students equally well, and that we still hear too often from parents who are Black and brown, that they don't feel that they or their children are welcome or respected in our schools. I hear that, and I agree and feel the urgency to respond to that. But in this moment, after having spent time with colleagues at the National Summit, I feel a great deal of hope about the sincere desire that I heard from those colleagues about wanting to change the school experience for their students, about whom they truly do care so deeply about. In this moment, after having spent time with parents at the community cafe and hearing about the Opal rally, I feel a great deal of hope about our commitment to hear from community members and to listen to their concerns and their criticisms with open ears and humility. We need all of these people: our educators, our administrators, our board, our parents and students, and our community activists, working in our own spheres and working together to continue the march towards the day that all children in District 65 have equal opportunities to reach their full potential. Thank you. Dr. Gorin?
Thank you very much, Suni, and good evening. I want to also share my welcome to all of our ETHS colleagues who are here this evening. As Dr. Witherspoon noted, we're working on many initiatives together, and it's a pleasure to have you here tonight, and it's a pleasure to continue our work together. It was also a pleasure to be satirized in the recent Yamo production, as was Dr. Witherspoon, but in my case, it was with my own son. So. I want to take an opportunity to share a new program that we just launched in 65 to recognize the hard work of our staff. With support from the First Bank and Trust, we have initiated the High Five Celebrating Excellence Staff Recognition Program. Each month, we will recognize one teacher and one educational support staff member from across the district for their outstanding work and dedication to our students, schools, and community. We're currently accepting nominations from District 65 staff, students, families, and community members, and the nomination form can be found on our website. As Suni noted, this morning, representatives from Opal held a press conference here at JEH to talk about Black student achievement and the long-standing gaps in opportunity and achievement that are present here in District 65. On many occasions, I have attempted to communicate that I share the same understanding of this problem as those in the community that are advocating for achievement and greater support for Black and Latino students. As the leader of this district, as a leader who is white, I fear that I have not been able to communicate in ways that convey the full depth of my beliefs on these issues. So here's what I really want everyone to hear from me. I know that Black and Latino students in our community are not being provided what they need to achieve their full potential, and that is not okay. I could go through the laundry list of things that we are doing in our district to address this, but I don't need to do that again. I believe we are taking unprecedented and long due steps to dismantle systemic and institutional racism and to provide opportunities for staff to examine bias and to think deeply about issues of race in intentional and thoughtful ways. Our work in District 65 is extensive and includes best practices in literacy, culturally relevant teaching, school climate, changes in our hiring processes, and early childhood education, along with supports for striving students. We also are continuing to examine and working to change our hiring processes. As we do this work, I want to salute our colleagues at District 202, as they have partnered with us and continue to do so as both districts move forward on our important equity agendas. As part of this work, last week, over 40 staff members, as Suni mentioned, joined members of our school board, members of our senior team, and joined me at the Courageous Conversations Summit in Detroit. An important takeaway for me from last week's summit is that the primary predictor of whether a district will achieve more racially equitable outcomes is whether leadership has done the work to deeply examine the role of race in the management and operations of our district. Every member of my leadership team and our school board, nearly all of our school administrators, and hundreds of teachers have begun this work and are committed to continuing until we are able to deliver. We still have much work to do and know that we cannot stop until we improve outcomes significantly for Black students and Latino students. I want to recognize the teachers and the administrators and staff who are focused and committed to this work and to the improvement of student outcomes. Their commitment to our children, to their work as educators, to diving deep on issues related to race, and to our agenda on equity also gives me hope as we move forward. As an organization, we take full responsibility and have made equitable outcomes for Black students in District 65 a priority. I encourage all of you to visit the equity-focused section of our website for details on the work currently underway in District 65. I look forward to continued collaboration with our staff, families, and community partners, and with our District 202 colleagues as we continue on this very important journey. And thank you very much.
So I wrote down some comments as well, and I really appreciate being in this room. And I'm looking forward to our larger conversation, and very much appreciate the collaboration that we're all bravely engaging in as two districts. I'm also going to courageously share my lens about the work that we have yet to do in our district. And while I have hope, I also understand and empathize with the voices that we heard today that were frustrated because we know that institutional change takes time. It takes time, it takes long-term commitment, but also as those who are most centrally affected by the need for the institutional change, patience is not the primary feeling. So I ask that my comments be heard from my particular lens, and also that we think about how the compass affects our reaction to this information and how we consider being courageous and hearing all of the perspectives of where our district is in this work. So one, the Courageous Conversations Summit this weekend was powerful. It was wonderful to see so many people from 65 and 202 and to hear honest, genuine reflections from everyone in the debrief sessions. There is a lot of power and commitment and courage within our institution to do this work, and we have some steps that we need to take in order to fully cultivate and benefit from all of that energy that we have in one another and in the staff who have attended the summit, who have attended Beyond Diversity, and who have taken advantage of SEED. And so I applaud everyone who is continuing to engage in this around this table and in our schools. And also in our community, as we have parents who are actively seeking opportunities to receive the same training. I want to say thank you to our community that came to share their concerns at Opal's press conference. We heard from residents and parents about the depth of their concerns about disparities in how our institution provides access to achievement for Black students and children of color writ large. Questions about our specific plans to respond as an institution. One, these are disparities that have been created in two ways. Use of assessment tools that are essentially Eurocentric, and two, exclusionary practices that have been embedded in our nation's institutions since the origins of our nation. And I want to call out also that Ta-Nehisi Coates was here last week speaking bravely to the world and to our community about being honest with ourselves about our history. So if we're honest with ourselves about our history and our institution, these opportunities to achieve are not personal, they are not individual, they have been built into our institutions, starting with our nation's history connected with the enslavement of African peoples, robbing African peoples of their cultural heritage and connection to their community, their language, and access to autonomy and opportunities to educate themselves. That was followed by Jim Crow, which carried on for almost 100 years. And currently we see that in our gaps in the way we have access to housing, how that impacts access to education. Distribution of Social Security originally did not happen for Black people, so there is a tremendous wealth gap as a result of policies that have been built into our institutions. And then we also have the gap in how our communities and how people, even living in the same community, are policed differently and are engaged with the criminal justice system differently. That is what has contributed to this gap in opportunity to achieve. And if we're not honest with where the responsibility lies, then we don't move urgently in correcting it. The responsibility lies with our institutions. Our families and our children, we talk a lot about risk factors. It's necessary for a lot of grants to talk about risk factors. However, children are not risk factors. Families are not risk factors. They have been affected by institutions that over generations have failed them and have intentionally marginalized them. And so when we talk about risk factors, I think it's really important for us also to talk about assets. Our children who are experiencing tremendous marginalization that affects their ability to engage with our education system have tremendous assets, a tremendous amount of resilience, flexibility. We're asking children at the age of 3 to learn how to code switch. There are adults who have a difficult time code switching. We're asking them to take on emotional work that some people don't take on till middle age and maybe never in their lives. And they're doing it effectively. So our children have a lot of assets. We don't have a way of measuring it, and our institutions don't have a good way of capturing it and talking about it. But I think that it's really important for us to think differently about culturally relevant education, culturally relevant staffing, because that allows for people to look for assets and look for strengths where institutions historically have not been set up to think about children and families that way. I'm off script, so I'm going to get back on my script. So I'm going to repeat myself, but I'm going to get back on my script. All of our children and families have assets, strengths, and gifts that they bring to our schools. And the long-term impact of racism and other elements of institutional exclusion leads to the institution having a difficult time recognizing, uplifting, and validating those contributions from some. This marginalization falls distinctly along the lines of race and ethnicity, and is most pronounced for our Black children in this district and across the country. Some of whom actually, against all odds, achieve at very high levels, even though this institution wasn't created to see their intelligence, and these assessment tools were not necessarily created for them to access, they still achieve at very high levels. And I can speak personally as one of those children that was always considered the exception. That was always one of the only Black children in spaces. And I knew that my parents, that my ancestors were smart too. Why was I the only one? It's unacceptable. And I was the only one because our institution was not prepared to educate people and give them the opportunity to not be the only one. And I'll just say this, because I've been crying a lot in the last week. I'm pregnant. I think my hormones. and this topic of conversation, because it's very personal to me as a woman of color, but also as a woman of color who's raising children in a hostile world. It's very personal. Ms. Chapman highlighted the experience of children who are Black in our schools, who achieve at a high level and still feel otherized. They still feel like the expectations are low for them, and who self-select themselves out of opportunities in order to feel comfortable in their own learning environments. We should not be asking children in the 8th grade to make those kind of decisions, but the way our institution is set up, we do. And we have to be honest about that, and we have to have urgency around the way those children feel, and with the way those parents feel when they have to comfort their children in that way. and tell them some very uncomfortable truths about the world and their life ahead of them. When we want to tell them that they can do anything, we have to tell them that there are limitations. I'm gonna stop and center myself for a second. When we listen to our children and families, we hear hope in their high expectations for themselves and their children, but we also hear hopelessness in what they believe the institution will allow of them. We hear deep love for their children and also understanding of their aptitude, but hopelessness that the institution's ability to listen, to learn, to make room for them, or frankly, to make room for them, to have any appreciation for difference in ways of understanding, difference in use of vernacular, appreciation for cultural representations, and vision of themselves in literature, arts, math, history, images of strength, images of beauty. We don't allow that for our children of color. Those exist, but they're not embedded in our institution. Our children of color in this district make up 60% of our district collectively. And knowing that 40% of those children of color are Black and brown and are systematically excluded should call us to urgent action. I want us to learn as an institution, and I want us to act urgently. That's one reason that I've requested, and Dr. Gordon and I have been working on with staff, Ismailis and Peter, thank you, on pulling information for us to understand what specific staffing supports we have in place for our Black and Latino families, to think about pedagogical practices, assessment tools, and access points that we are specifically looking to correct within our institution for those populations who are currently suffering in their marginalization in our school district. We need to be clear that where we are hitting the mark and where we are not, and how we're going to improve. That leads me to my last point, which is that when we look at our institution and the lack of access, that impact is extended beyond children and families. It's also extended to our educators and administrators. Even the most intelligent, committed, and social justice-oriented educator may be challenged in fully bringing their values and culturally relevant curriculum to their classroom without the permission to be brave and bold, without the larger institutional support and time for collaboration in doing this work, and resources to do this work. They too are affected and limited by the culture of work that they are charged with. And that is also the reason why I charge our institution to think not only about recruiting people of color, but retaining people of color. If our institution is not prepared to allow them to fully bring themselves to their work and provide culturally relevant instruction, and to be flexible in that way, then they won't stay. What I saw at Summit and have seen at Beyond Diversity sessions and from our seed cohorts is a deeply affected staff. They too want more. They want to be more connected, they want to be more innovative, they want to be more just. And they need proper high-level supports to give them permission to move forward in this journey. They need a strategic and targeted collection of people that are working together with the sole intention of bringing expertise about culturally relevant instruction, assessment, and practices to our classrooms in support of all children's access, particularly Black children who have historically been excluded or treated as exceptions in this institution. So I encourage us to hear from our community and to hear from our community in an empathetic way, and to honor the very human instinct to feel defensive. I think it's natural when being criticized to have a human response to that, but also to use the tools at hand, such as the compass, to validate and listen and empathize and work together to come up with urgent, responsive solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you for so bravely speaking your truth and sharing your voice. I know I appreciate that, and thinking of the compass. You've put me very much in feeling, so thank you for that. On that note, we will transition to comments from the public. Members of the public are welcome and invited to address the board during open public meetings. The Board of Education will not permit the voicing of personal attacks against any district employee. Please remember to state your name and that you have 3 minutes to address the board. At the end of 3 minutes, you will hear the timer go off, and I will state thank you, and then in fairness to keep us on track, we will ask you to conclude your comments. So our first speaker is Vicki Proctor.
Good evening. My name is Vicki Proctor. I'm a former District 65 retired teacher. And we're kind of sharing this. We've signed up in tandem.
Good evening, I'm Tom Sims. I'm a former Evanston resident and taught in District 65 for 28 years. And I'm a member of the Evanston Civic Action Committee.
Hi, I'm Ken Cantor, retired professor of education from National Louis University.
You just have to pick up a local newspaper or talk to your neighbor to get the latest news about violent crimes in Evanston. Neighborhoods without resources such as libraries, troublesome relationships between community and police, District 65 struggle with the achievement gap, and families struggling economically. These unacceptable inequalities must be addressed not only by City Council, but in our schools. We stand here tonight because we believe research supports a strong connection between a commitment to civic education and resolving community problems. Evanston is not alone in facing these issues. Nationally, we bear the burden and challenge of a poorly informed and involved electorate, in spite of the fact that the very survival of our democracy at every level depends on well-educated citizens who recognize and act on their civic duties. Only 57% of Americans voted in the 2016 election. The numbers in Evanston were slightly higher, but hardly a cause for celebration. If only 50% of graduates met the required academic standards, it would be considered a crisis. The actual voting participation by 18 to 29-year-olds is even lower. Schools have an opportunity to affect this situation. It is in our schools that students must receive a sound education about our democracy so as to encourage the development of knowledge, inquiry skills, and critical thinking. We must reinvigorate civics education with a rigorous curriculum. Thankfully, there are some positive signs. We applaud the state of Illinois' leadership in adopting policies and programs supporting civic education. In 2011, the Illinois Senate passed Resolution 149, encouraging civic education. In 2015, Governor Rauner signed into law a requirement that high schools provide a semester of civics education. Beginning in fall of 2017, District 202 sophomores will be engaged in a year-long civics education class.
Now is the time for District 65 to recommit to civic education instruction at every grade level. Students of all races and socioeconomic levels need the experience of working together to strengthen their civic knowledge and to learn effective engagement in their communities. Imagine kindergartners meeting with police officers and middle school students communicating with our police to discuss safety issues. Imagine younger students learning about the workers of Evanston and older students engaged in a debate about minimum wage. Imagine our youngest understanding that where they live determines their representation on city council, and our older students actively involved in neighborhood issues such as the location of library branches. Imagine K-8 students able to discuss many points of view about any issue. Then imagine students' academic growth. Research supports that a strong civic education produces academic achievements. How can District 65 embark on this path of a stronger civic education for all students? We suggest this board add planning for a K-12 civic education curriculum to the Joint District 65-202 committee. Teachers at every level and every subject should be part of this conversation. Let's do our part to ensure that we strengthen our community and our democracy. Again, we presenters are Tom Sims, Vicki Proctor, and myself, Ken Cantor, and this is supported by members of our Citizens Action Network in Evanston, Chuck Cole, Judy Saunders, Maureen Sheehy, Deborah Hirschfield, Steve Littell, Ann McMahon, Ellen Esrick, Jody Gross, Linda Gartz, Kim Okabe, Pam Elish, Jim Elish, Tom Iabaldi, Marina Iabaldi, Hank Sheff, Ann Bartling, Barbara Musius, Eric Musius, Judy Chiss, Bernie Cohn, Sheldon Proctor, Kathy Lee, and Dan Tarlock.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very
Okay,
much.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Margarita Mathis.
I read your report, joint report, that seemed to have encouraging results. But I also was today outside talking to people of Opal, and they have discouraging reports. And I've been here for over 50 years in this town, and my kids started school in 1975. From that time on, I was involved in school matters. And the statistics that we see today about the differences between colored students and white students were there the same before. And just to show you, I brought a speech that Judith Sterinsky, that used to be District 65 board member, she said in 1991, I'll just quote a few paragraphs. But we wanted, what we wanted to do was have the black student scores particularly go up faster than whites. The other student scores, I should say. And I'm sitting here and looking at the kid, at where the kids started and where they ended up in terms of the gap. If we go down the list, you see that it's still running right around 40 percentile points. No matter what grades you look at, no matter what when they started, no matter when they finished, we're still 40 percentile points. It's been that way for years. And I think the thing that disappoints me the most, this being my last regular board meeting, is that I sat here now for 4 years, and before that I spent another 7 years on the other side of the table. And we still have the same 40% gap. And we haven't found the answer yet. I don't know where we go or what we do, but this is possibly the most disappointing thing that I faced in a non-personal experience in my entire life. That I walked through this door 12 years ago with a 40%, which nobody knew about because we weren't telling anybody then. But it was there, and I'm walking out of the door 12 years later, and we're still there, and I'm walking out, and we're still got the same gap. We haven't done anything about it. Judy Sterinsky, October 21, 1991. So, and I've been following the school's situation every year after 4 of my kids went through the system, and reading the newspaper and everything, and it seems like the issue of the gap is still there. So I always thought that there were 3 components to education. One was the school.
Thank you. Thank you. That was 3 minutes.
May I finish?
If you can wrap up quickly, yes, please.
Okay. 3 components. One is the schools, and they can't do everything. Another one is the parents. And many of them are Hispanics like me who have no idea how the system works. They have to have a special program for them to know what they have to do with the kids. And other parents don't know what to do with their own little kids from the very beginning. Another one, of course, is the kids. And in this D65, there used to be a contract. The contract that was signed by the school, the parents, and the children. And each one had a responsibility to do something. And then there is, I think that should be reinstated.
Okay. Thank you.
Just one more important thing. The University of Maryland, I was just talking to somebody there, they receive demands for tours by schools around the area for little kids as far young as before kindergarten. They want to go to the colleges, they want to talk to the professors, they want to see what happens there, they want to see the students, and they want to talk about colleges. And so there are demands and demands and demands for these tours. And I think this is what we should do here too. We have Northwest University very willing.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments. Our next speaker will be Roger Williams.
District 202 Board, District 65 Board. I'm Roger Williams. I'm the president of OPAL. And as you are aware, we had a press conference out right here this morning. And we did this, I guess it was something that we felt compelled to really do at this point in time. And let me go on because I know that the clock is running and the timekeeper is at work. Let me read something here to you. For the last 3 years, OPAL has pushed and collaborated with the District 65 Board and Superintendent to provide meaningful solutions to the achievement gap and has waited patiently for meaningful and steady results. In those 3 years, the district has failed black students by hiring too few black teachers, has used a curriculum that doesn't highlight positive contributions from black culture, and has disproportionately disciplined black students compared to their white classmates. While we applaud the district's response to OPAL's request for data disaggregated by race, the district's adoption of a racial equity policy, finally, the district mandated that all staff complete the Beyond Diversity training by 2019. We applaud you for that. However, we remain disappointed that there have been no statistically significant gains in black student achievement. This is unacceptable to us, and it should be unacceptable to you. That this generous community has so graciously provides numerous resources to help all students succeed. This lack of urgency, accountability, and gains for black students has convinced us that the district needs to hire a director of black student achievement, a cabinet-level position with a budget and with a support staff so that they can do the job that's so definitely needs to be done at this point. Acclaimed researcher Sean Reardon confirmed what the black community in Evanston has said for some time. Even when socioeconomic differences are zero, you still see sizable achievement gaps, and that says, I think the American society is still structured in ways that create unequal opportunity by race. Evanston has one of the largest achievement gaps in the country. but it's a large achievement gap, not because the black students are failing, but because the white and affluent students are being enriched so much by so much opportunity. Finally, to Evanston residents, if we want to be the Evanston we think we are, we have to demand that District 65 quit making excuses, create goals, plans, and programs with a sense of urgency to directly attack the achievement gap. We want to achieve racial equity in our schools now. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final speaker for the evening will be Karen Courtwright.
Good evening. I just want to underline a couple of things that Opal has been pointing out. First of all, one thing that has not yet been mentioned at any length is the school-to-prison pipeline. And I think that my circle of friends is not very well populated with people of color, and yet even I know 3 families who tell stories of their children being mistreated on playgrounds and them receiving disproportionate punishment compared to a white child that they may have been tussling with. And that these families then, I cannot believe they have to do this, leave the district. This is unforgivable, and we have to do whatever it takes to train the people who educate and supervise our children in these schools to not allow their implicit biases to come to bear until such time as their hearts are changed. And I'd also like to ask that your new program, recognizing achievement among teachers and support staff, be used to especially reinforce those educators and support staff who do have open hearts and right thinking with respect to equitable treatment of all children. And I agree that the gap having increased in the last 40 years is just indescribably wrong, and that we have to stop thinking ourselves around in circles and start putting our money where it is needed, because that's what it is. It's resources. And when I was last here listening to the debate about detracking algebra, I could not believe that we're talking about, God forbid, taking away some crumb of opportunity for white students to achieve even more at the expense of black children and Latinx children in our district. So I urge you to take up the call for greater urgency, especially with respect to hiring. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we will, did you sign up to? Okay. Okay, fine. So please state your name and then 3 minutes.
Sorry, I was late for the sheet. My name is Yancey Hughes. I'm a parent of a 9th grader here at the high school and also a 4th grader at Lincoln. And I just want to ask, where can a parent go to obtain MAP scores for each grade and by race? I think it would be helpful. The district puts out the overall average, but I think it would be insightful to see average MAP scores per grade, per race throughout the district. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we will move on to our discussion items, the first of which is the Superintendent's Joint Achievement Report. Paul, Eric, would you like to?
I think our colleagues are going to start the conversation. If I can just give a prelude, this is always a really important time for us because Dr. Witherspoon and I and our staffs look at key and compelling questions that we want to dig deeper in, and as it relates to student achievement, as it relates to achievement and opportunity gaps, and we want to be able to explore as deeply as possible the trajectory that our children, our students are on. And so this provides us with opportunity to look deeply at data and to be able to see how well our children are progressing in their trajectory from District 65 through District 202 and into college and university. And so, and we'll talk about this later on this evening as well. A lot of this work is also going to be embedded in the work that we're doing through our partnership with Northwestern as well.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Peter Goddard, and I'm the Chief Officer for Accountability, Equity, and Organizational Development here in District 65. And I want to share tonight some results from a study that I have been working on with my colleague, Carrie Levy from District 202. I will start by framing the purpose for the study that we put together. This is the third joint achievement report that we have worked on together. And then I'll turn it over to Carrie to share the details of the analysis and the results that we found. But we also want to share with you some information about our continued partnership together with Northwestern universities. So let me begin then just by sharing the purpose of the joint achievement report that we worked on this year. We really wanted to take a look at students' transitions, particularly from 8th to 9th grade, and then from 9th grade into college. And as we got into looking at what data we had, we really focused our question specifically on data we had on students and the extent to which it could predict their future enrollment in college. So the three questions that we looked at together using data from middle school and high school and then from the National Student Clearinghouse enrollment in college were, first, what variables for Black and Hispanic or Latino students' middle school experiences predict their success in high school? Then what variables for the same groups of students predict success after high school in college? And then we looked about how each of these two factors varied by students' gender in addition to their racial ethnic identity. So let me turn it over to Carrie to take us forward with the analysis.
Thank you. So the method we used, we analyzed two cohorts of students. These are students who completed 8th grade in District 65 in 2009-10 and 10-11, and transferred to ETHS, District 202, and graduated within 5 years. So these are students who have matriculated from District 65 through 02. This is an exploratory analysis. So our outcome for this is post-secondary enrollment. At this point, these 5-year graduates are 2015 and 16 5-year graduates, so we do not have enough time to look at persistence. So as this is an exploratory analysis, we looked at post-secondary enrollment. Sorry. The outcomes, the high school outcomes, the variables we looked at was a final cumulative GPA of 2.8. Taking and earning a C or higher and 2 algebra. Enrolling at least 1 AP course and meeting or exceeding ACT college readiness benchmarks in English and math. These are starting points for the exploratory analysis, and these variables were chosen because they are indicators that have been identified in the Illinois Every Student Succeed Act as college-ready indicators. So as this is an exploratory analysis, we decided to start there. And the grade 8 outcomes, trying to kind of align with what these high school outcomes were, looking at MAP, reading and math, college readiness, MAP national percentile rank in reading, and cumulative GPA in grade 8. Our sample size, so the focus of the report, as Peter had in the questions, is looking at our African American, Black, and Hispanic Latino students. Our sample size, our total sample size across these two cohorts are 322 African American Black students, 226 Hispanic Latino students. Once we take into account students who have transferred out, moved out of the district, the 5-year graduation rate for African American Black students was 92%, and for Hispanic Latino students was 94%. The focus going forward on the analysis that I'm going to show you that's in the report and on the slides going forward is the students who graduated within 5 years, taking out those that have transferred, and have enrolled in a post-secondary. So on the slide, I can show you we have 270 African-American Black students who enrolled in post-secondary who have enrolled, and 194 Hispanic Latino students. That's our sample size. And as I will reference later, we focus on students who have graduated and enrolled. When we start to look at data and disaggregate the variables by students who have not yet enrolled, becomes too small of a sample sizes, cell sizes to ethically report on.
And Carrie, just to clarify, these are District 65 eighth graders who have
Yes.
graduated from District 65 who have then progressed through the high school.
Correct. Okay. Yes. So, thank you. So our first finding is just looking at students who have progressed through, graduated, and enrolled. 80% of African-American Black students and 74% of Hispanic Latino graduates have enrolled in a post-secondary institution. And I just made a comment about the fact that why you're only focusing on in students who have graduated and enrolled. When we disaggregate by race, by gender, and we look at students' enrollment in post-secondary, we see that we have a higher percent of females, so our Black females and our Latino, Hispanic Latino females have enrolled in a post-secondary institution than male students. So here, now I will start to sort of report on some of the variables that we chose to look at in this exploratory analysis. So one that we looked at was taking Algebra 2 and earning a C or higher. And these results, when we disaggregate them by race, by gender, a majority of graduates enrolled in a post-secondary institution earned a C or higher into algebra. So across the board, our first bar, and I'm sorry I didn't go through this on the previous slide, is African-American Black females, 83%, and 77% of our Black males, 84% of Latino females, and 87% of Latino males took Algebra 2 and earned a C or higher. Another variable we looked at was whether or not students took at least one AP course by the time they graduated. So we see a majority of students did, 68% of our Black males and females took at least one AP course by the time of graduation. The highest percent, Hispanic Latino females, 84% took at least one AP course, and 79% of our Hispanic Latino males took at least one AP course by time of graduation. Another variable that's identified as a career-ready variable in the Illinois Every Student Succeed Act is meeting or exceeding a college readiness benchmark. So the ACT English College Readiness Benchmark, is a scale score of 18. So looking at students, graduates who have enrolled in post-secondary enrollment, we see around half, slightly over half, 56% of our Black females met that or exceeded that benchmark, 58% of Black males, 56% Hispanic Latino females, and 61% of Hispanic Latino males met or exceeded the college readiness benchmark in English. In math, the scale score for meeting or exceeding the ACT college readiness benchmark is 22. And so we look at and we see 29% of African American Black females, graduates enrolled in a post-secondary institution met or exceeded that college readiness benchmark in math. 47% of Black males met or exceeded that benchmark. 41% of Hispanic Latino females and 52% of males, Hispanic Latino males, met or exceeded that benchmark. So as this is an exploratory and we still have a lot of work we're going to do, which we will talk about, initial appearances is not a barrier to post-secondary enrollment.
So I want to just highlight one of the several 8th grade outcomes that we also looked at. And this is students who are scoring above the 50th percentile on the grade 9 MAP reading assessment. Here what you can see is that all groups, African American and Black females and males, and Hispanic or Latino females and males, scored 79% or more of those who scored at or above the 50th percentile went on to enroll in college once they graduated from ETHS. And for the female categories, you can see that that's over 90% for both African American and Black females and Hispanic and Latino females. So Carrie has mentioned that we treated this as an exploratory analysis. We were really interested to know, using some of the criteria that the State Board of Education will be using to evaluate our districts, whether those criteria are good predictors of whether students will be successful in enrolling in college after graduation. And I think we were interested in some of what we found, but we both agreed that what we found is not sufficient to really allow us to draw all the conclusions that we would want to be able to draw and to be able to take our analysis and turn it into a useful tool for educators. And so that's really where our partnership with Northwestern University comes in. So we also thought it was important in the context of the analysis that we've presented to you to give you a sense of where we think we are going to go next and how we are going to involve Northwestern University and our partners there in the Northwestern Evanston Educational Research Alliance, or NERA, as we go forward. So we spoke to you about this last back in February, and Dr. David Figlio came and addressed the joint boards and shared some of the vision around developing an on-track indicator. We enter that work with hope and also recognizing that on-track indicators can be used in multiple ways. And just like data in education in general, that we need to be careful about how we conceptualize the use of on-track indicators, particularly when it comes to historically marginalized and particularly Black and Hispanic students. What we intend to do next with Northwestern, with that caveat in mind about use, is to use many of the same data points that we have used here to go beyond an exploratory analysis and do more predictive modeling using the knowledge and skills and techniques of the researchers who we have partnered with. At this point, as we shared with you previously, we've received some grant money to sustain this partnership. Northwestern has hired an individual who will be coordinating the partnership going forward, and we have met regularly with them over the course of the last 6 months or so, but particularly since July when Lila came on board, to begin to do two things. First, to map out a very specific project plan for creating an on-track indicator using predictive analytics that would allow us to more concretely state what are the characteristics of a student in 10th grade, 9th grade, 8th grade, 7th grade that are likely to predict their success in college. And those criteria are likely to be different from what we've historically used just in terms of test scores. It allows us to potentially have a more robust set of indicators to help identify students who may need some additional supports to be successful. So we've been working with Northwestern on that. We have a preliminary project plan that we're in final review stages on, and we have a data sharing agreement in place so that once we come to agreement about how the analysis will be conducted, we can exchange the data and Northwestern can get started on the research. We anticipate that happening probably within the next month or so, I would say. In addition to that, we've also been working with Northwestern more generally on how they can be a partner to us in our efforts around equity. And so both districts have developed an equity-related research agenda that we have drafted and begun to refine that will allow us to communicate clearly to folks at Northwestern about what our priorities are as a district and the ways in which researchers could be helpful to us in pursuing our goals. And so we're also, beyond this initial analysis, which will be a proof of concept of how we can work together, looking at ways that Northwestern can support us more broadly in terms of helping us evaluate the effectiveness of some of our efforts, potentially looking at various research activities that can support our broader equity agenda across the 2 school districts. So let me leave it there, and then Carrie and I would be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. So with that, I'll open it to board questions. And I see it's so, I guess this can be questions on the achievement report or on, I think that was the NERA update too that was on the agenda. So maybe start off with questions regarding the joint achievement report, and then we can transition into the Northwestern partnership. So opening up to board members. Jonathan?
Thank you for your work. I understand you're probably sort of frustrated that you can't that it doesn't rise to the level of prediction as distinct from exploratory, but we're on the way, right? It's a step. So, it seemed to me that there were some numbers which I understand that you can't have confidence that certain things are predictive, but it seems pretty clear that certain things are not predictive. I mean, when you have factors like some of the GPA figures and I know it was the MAP exceeding MAP CRB, where in fact fewer of the students who had who exceeded ended up in college than those who didn't. So does this give you some guidance into, I understand that you can't figure out exactly what is predictive yet, but suggest that certain measures are not predictive?
I think it gives a good starting point, so we know when we start running, when Northwestern starts helping us in running analyses and models, that we picked I'll pick on GPA right now. The 2.8 cut point is what is in the Illinois State Report. So I'm like, well, we'll just start there and see does that even have any meaning? And that's hard to interpret. And so when we do the work with Northwestern, we get to look at it not just at these points, but we have the range of GPA and really where does it fall? Maybe it's lower or higher. Where does it really fall instead of just a cut point, and helping us really identify maybe it's not that variable, it's a combination of variables. And this as an exploratory just looked at variables on their own, not as a combination and how they're related. And that's part of the more complicated work that we get to do with Northwestern. It's the same with ACT. So that college readiness benchmark means you have a 75% likelihood of getting a C or better in your first year English class. Well, I don't know what that means. I mean, clearly that in the math doesn't really show that it's a barrier. So how does ACT fit into a larger model? And it's a more complicated thing that we're looking to move forward with. So to answer your question, it doesn't really tell us anything that's predictive. It just gave us some descriptives in this exploratory, trying to understand this is what the state's telling us that they think is college ready. These are some of the variables, and where we're going to have to figure out our own model, multiple measure model that's Evanston specific, that we can feel more confident about going forward.
And if I could just add a little more context to that, the outcome we're looking for is college persistence. So, we also don't know how these variables will play with college persistence when we get to it. But in terms of college going, we can make those, look at those correlations and say, yeah, right now, in terms of college going, college readiness benchmark does not seem to be an indicator. We don't know about persistence yet.
Another pattern that occurred to me as I looked at it that may, again, change with persistence as the measure versus college entrance. It seemed that some of the measures from 8th grade were more predictive than measures from high school. And it just seems to me that's a very, at least I would find that very intriguing in terms of how you pursue your research. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so I think it's an interesting trend, and in fact, it was almost so interesting that it made me suspicious, right? Because you would expect that something happening in 11th grade would be much more predictive of
Right.
something happening 2 years later than that's something that happened to the same student back in 8th grade.
Right.
So I don't know why that is, but to Carrie's point about looking at the variables in a continuous manner and looking at them in combination, it may be that some of the particular variables that we picked out and at the particular cut points that we picked out in 8th grade are better predictors than the particular variables at the particular cut points that we picked out for some of the high school measures. What Northwestern analysis will let us see is, I would expect that high school GPA would be a better predictor of college persistence than 8th grade MAP score, but it may not be that at the 2.8 cut point it is a better predictor. So I think that's my working hypothesis that I hope to explore as we work with Northwestern.
Thanks.
Gretchen?
Thanks. As I'm listening to you tonight run through this, I read the report, obviously, before the meeting. I'm hearing more clearly tonight a refrain around predictability. And it's jumping out at me more listening to you tonight than it did when I was reading the report. And one of the things I'm getting hung up on is predicting for the sake of predicting, I think, is an interesting intellectual exercise. But I think we need to flip it around a little bit. And you didn't ignore this, because I was taking notes, and eventually you said, after using the word predictability, on-track indicators many, many times, you said, and then we'll be able to identify students who might need additional support. And then you went on. And I'm not criticizing you personally, it's how it came out to me. And I think in light of the concerns that we're hearing from the community very clearly tonight, and I think in light of the concerns shared by every member of both boards and our administration in both school districts, I think the piece that we really need to be thinking about and emphasizing and communicating with our families about is not how we're going to predict what may or may not happen with their kids, but what we're going to do to get them to a place that we're happy to predict. And do you see what I'm saying? And I'm not trying to be silly or semantic about this, but the point of this exercise is not to call things out, it's to fix the problem. And I think that's what we're really, really struggling with as a school district. So it's more of a comment than a question, but maybe you have something to say to that. And I think it's how are we using this?
And that's the ultimate goal, and I'm trying to be careful about using that word predictive, because this is not, as I was trying to be very specific in saying, it's exploratory. And while there has to be some model that's predictive, the goal of it is to have ultimately a model that says, okay, at grades 12, 11, 10, 9, all the way down, there are certain variables that have been identified to say when our students are on track or not, for not just post-secondary enrollment or success or a variety of measures, however we define it, so that we have information to give to our administrators and personnel and say, okay, these students we know are not meeting X, Y, and Z, so here's some information so you know who to go support. It's not just create a pretty little model.
And I appreciate you saying this, and it seems to me that really what we're talking about doing is, in addition to the work that you're doing, which is, pretty technical, statistical, sometimes a little dry, there's almost like a parallel path that our districts need to be following, and that relates to, how we communicate this, and how we interweave these two things so that it becomes not just an intellectual exercise, but a tool to move where our students are going. Not just to...
That's our job, to make sure as we go through this process, and there's a certain process that we do facilitate and be very, very mindful of what you're saying.
And I'm sure you are, and I'm just trying to call it out in a way that highlights it.
So I share that concern, right? In fact, what I'm most concerned about is what this report does not tell us. And one of those items was actionable. What is not included in this report is how students do who come to ETHS from other districts, particularly the Chicago Public Schools and outside schools outside of Illinois. Students who transfer in don't fare as well in terms of all of these outcomes we looked at. So what we've done is we actually flag students in the system who transfer in, and we monitor them closely. We've talked about this at previous board meetings. But,
And Cradle to Career.
And Cradle to Career, we talked about this as well. So this is one of those things that when you look, the report doesn't tell us that, but when we held up that comparison on our own, we were like, wow, look at that. That's something we really need to flag and do an intervention on. But there's other things this report doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us about college persistence. And while it does provide some insights regarding outcomes for Black and Latino students who come from District 65 to ETHS, I just want to be clear that just now is not the time to pat ourselves on the back for this. The administration doesn't want to do that. I don't think the boards want to do that. Instead, this report asks us to do a whole lot more. It asks us to get those early indicators, those on-track indicators up and running in a real quick fashion. It also asks us to look deeper and, most importantly, to take action. This year, ETHS has started a curriculum review process. And central to that process is leveraging student voice, particularly the voice of students of color, to directly influence curriculum development. We have a very rich history at ETHS going back over 100 years of adults making decisions, and primarily adult white males like myself making decisions about academic achievement and curriculum for students of color and for all of our students. So I've partnered with our equity analyst, Lauren Hamilton, and our Department of Research and Evaluation to create a mechanism, sort of a focus group sort of approach, to really get student voice, in a very systematic way to inform our curriculum development and to inform our curriculum review process. Now, I did a quick lit search to see, actually it's a pretty extensive lit search back in September to see how to do this, because usually you go on the higher ed libraries and you do a lit search and you find a ton of resources. There really aren't any for this work, which tells me that this is a glaring omission in curriculum review in general. So we're taking action. We're going to get students together. We're framing the work. And more importantly, these focus groups will be completed by the beginning of second semester. We'll have our curriculum review teams then go out utilizing that data, that input, along with the quantitative data we've seen. So really the idea is, and that's the one non-negotiable is the student voice piece. So yes, this report tells us some things, but there is a whole heck of a lot of work. Some of it's quantitative and some of it's qualitative, but we really need to do that, and I'll share how that goes with my partners at District 65, and maybe we can leverage that in 65 as well.
Thank you. Joey?
My question was specifically about what the data doesn't show. What is evident in the story that you shared was that the kids that have been in the system throughout fare okay. The kids that are doing well, that have been in the system for a while, do okay. And I think when you're in the system for a long time, that means stability at home, or at least in geography. It means a number of things that support the exploratory study that you've done so far. But you mentioned in the purpose bullets, the first two bullets at least, that one of the pieces of data you were going to look at was discipline referrals. And I'm specifically curious to know what the plan is, and I know this is probably another step, right? It's nuanced type work later, and it's messy work, to know the kids who are not faring well, the opposite graphs, if you will, who are not meeting readiness benchmarks, the kids who are not meeting the 8th grade or the high school targets, what their experience is like. And are there trends in behavior referral data? Is there any information that we keep that would tell us what their story is that might explain how they get to where they are, aside from just pure academic talent and school experience, right? Knowing where they come from, when do they transfer into our school systems? is important information, because then we know how long they're coming from. Where they come from matters, because then you can start to derive background information on what their previous experience has been. But particularly as it goes to the school to prison pipeline, knowing those kids who are not hitting those targets, at what point are we disenfranchising them? At what point is our institution possibly the reason for their step away from college or high school graduation? I'm curious to know if there's a number of students that you can begin to see whose lives we could impact and target, and where the interventions could be. And that's a marginal group. I know that's a fringe group, right? But I think that's a really important group to, if you could predict certain things like major office discipline referrals and X types of consequences are predictable variables for how we disenfranchise kids, right? Plenty of research around what suspensions do and things like that. Would love to know how changing those practices would impact those kids' ability to re-engage with the community, re-engage with school, re-engage with learning. And again, that might be more of a comment than a question to get an answer on now, but I think it's important work for a pretty specific group to know more about.
So I would just say, first, I agree. I think it's a variable that I would like to look at, and I think it does tell us some interesting information. We didn't include it in this report, partly due to data limitations. Data limitations in terms of the length of history of ODR data that we have in District 65 compared to some of the other data that we have. And the other thing being that we had some pretty significant changes to our discipline policies about 3 years ago. That would just affect the interpretation of the data, because it would be how predictive were discipline referrals given the way that discipline referrals were given out at the time that students who are currently in college were middle school students at District 65, which likely would be a different relationship than under the new policy that we have today.
No, that's fair.
And I would just add, Peter mentioned earlier that we're in the process of working with our colleagues at Northwestern on an analysis plan. We've met together as teams several times. We've also met separately with them to talk about each district's data, and that is some of the data that we were looking broadly. It includes discipline, attendance, a wide range of variables that are not captured in here at all. So that is, we're being very mindful of that too.
Are you able to add other variables? Like one of them was the number of students who have taken one college AP course, right? Are you able to have both look at it through one course, 2 courses, 3 courses, so that you can break it down by a number of variables around your first targeted variable?
We're going to have so much data that she has her work cut out for her.
Thank you.
Sergio?
I want to thank you again for working so hard on getting this information in regards to how kids fare from D65 and going on through their educational journey. So, thank you and your staff for the hard work that you put through in trying to share some of these numbers. Again, for me, it's promising. I agree with Assistant Superintendent Davis that, again, we shouldn't pat ourselves in the back. I mean, there is still a lot more work to do in regards to looking at not just, data points in regards to how kids are succeeding, but also looking at what family and community engagement, when we think of variables, right? Really expanding variables to include, family engagement, right? How are families engaged in a child's education? We all know, the research tells us, we all know that parents are the first teachers. So what do we do? To take this bioecological view of children's academic and social emotional success throughout their educational career in order to determine new ways to measure kids' ability to succeed and be productive citizens in our society, right? So as we continue, and again, I think we're going to talk about the NERO work that's going to happen between the districts and Northwestern. I would encourage us to really try to look at not just the individual child, because I think that's where I have a problem with a lot of research, that we really kind of just isolate the students, and we fail to see, to try to measure the access to the supports that kids get, or they don't. The job opportunities or economic opportunities that, or school opportunities that parents have or do not have to engage our school and community in a way that moves their families forward. So again, I urge us as joint boards to look at not just individual student success, but how parents and community all interplay to ensure that kids are succeeding in Evanston and just in general in life.
Thank you. Candace?
Thank you as well. So these questions, because having exploratory research then makes us explore in our heads a little bit more what else could be done. So there are a couple things that jumped out at me that I thought, as you are talking about what further work can be done, you might consider. One, I was really surprised because when you look at the percentage of black females basically exceeding the other groups in terms of getting post-secondary, but then looking at that college and career readiness benchmark, particularly around math, the ACT one, that was the lowest, I think, of all, 29%. And so what it made me wonder is, bear with me, if we are able to ultimately tell what types of college programs students are going into. Because I get concerned about math and science for girls, and particularly for girls of color. And so mapping, the kind of areas for high growth, high opportunity in math and science, and are we trending in those areas appropriately or the way we want? Are we underrepresented? Are we well represented? Just thinking about the career trajectory as we look at this data, because that kind of, it concerned me. I know we said that CRB wasn't necessarily a predictor of getting into college, but I would say CRB in math would likely, would be a predictor of doing well in a math or science related career. So just exploring that a little bit more as we think about the demands of the economy and where the jobs are and where, high paying, high success careers are, and are we mapping our kids to those careers, if there's any way to do that. So that's a big picture question. And then the other thing that I was curious about, because there certainly did seem to be the correlation prediction around having taken Algebra 2 and getting a C or better. Did you look at all at timing on that? Because we collectively have been talking a lot about, ensuring that all students have Algebra 1 in 8th grade, which would lead them to having Algebra 2 in 10th grade, at the latest. So is there any factor in terms of when a student takes that Algebra 2 class and succeeds at a C or higher that has some effect on, more inclination to be able to be prepared for college and career readiness? Just because we have that hypothesis in that assumption and what we're doing, and I wonder if it plays out. So
I didn't look at a time point. I just looked at whether or not they took Algebra 2 and earned a C or better. So we can certainly look
just,
into
again, something to consider.
range,
I know we've
but-
talked about some of the longitudinal kinds of things across in math, especially, being able to prove out what we believe to be the truth, about our work and what we should be doing in preparing kids in 8th grade or 7th and 8th grade, and how that affects their trajectory. So I would just, kind of take that mindset perhaps as you go forward with this. And then the other question I was curious about is similar to Joey, those kids who are in the 20% that aren't where we, the assumption is we want what's the definition of college or post-secondary? I guess it does go back a little bit to that, and I might have missed it in the reading, but if you could share, how are you defining that post-secondary experience? There are a lot of, really excellent careers that don't necessarily require a four-year degree, and how are those looked at in terms of this work, or is it purely what we would consider an academic environment?
No, it's any post-secondary institution, 2-year, 4-year, as reported by the National Clearinghouse.
Okay.
So that's the data set that I have to look at whether or not a student's enrolled. So it does miss some students. There are some places that maybe don't report to the clearinghouse, so there's a small amount that's missed. But it's any, regardless of 2-year, 4-year, public, private, anything that's considered post-secondary reported to the clearinghouse.
Okay, great, thanks. Sorry I missed that.
Yeah, Jude.
Thank you for all the work that you all have been doing, especially with the indicators. Those are key, the access points in preparation for post-secondary. One thing I was thinking about that could be looked at as a variable is college exposure, early college exposure and awareness. The data does show that the earlier students are exposed to college and careers and are made aware, the more likely they are to attend. And I don't know to what extent or how early on in District 65 that we provide awareness, college-going awareness, but that may be something that that we want to look at and may want to consider to start exposing our students in the district earlier to college and career-going options and pathways. Just exposure in general and awareness.
Well, our freshmen, complete ICAP. They start the ICAP process, individual career and academic planning process. And we've been very intentional about doubling down on that freshman completion rate, particularly for students of color, particularly for black males. I don't know what the exposure to college looks like. I mean, I'm a creature of the high school, and I have been for a very long time. I don't know what that looks like in District 65, but I will tell you that having a post-secondary plan or an interest, right, in a career is a variable that can be tracked all the way down to like first, second, third grade, and is one of those hinge point variables. The work of Angel Harris is really compelling on that. And he was a fan speaker a couple, 2-3 years ago, 4 years ago. So we're very serious about rolling that out at the high school level. We've been doing that for about 5 years, I want to say. And we use Freshman Advisory Study Hall to really get that work up and going. We also have a career counselor in the hub, which is our student center, and she does a lot of work with employers. She brings employers in. We do that kind of work too. We have college visits, and college visits are open just like our employment visits to any student at ETHS.
Anya.
So it was really exciting actually to hear about student engagement around curriculum work, and so love to hear how that matriculates down to us, that experience. I feel like one of the factors that is really difficult to measure, and I hear you all in saying there's copious amounts of data, and just decisions have to be made in terms of what data is actually analyzed. But one of the things that we miss when we talk about student achievement is the social emotional experience that children are having and how that affects how they engage or disengage with their education. And it was really exciting at the Courageous Conversation Summit. There was I think Bellevue, Washington District uses a panoramic system to do surveys, student surveys, including at the elementary level. And they asked students actually, in particular, how comfortable they feel with their racial and ethnic identity being recognized in their schooling. And they asked about relationships with teachers, relationships with other children, et cetera. But they have some questions that are specifically about how children are self-identifying and how they are internalizing their interaction with the school district and in their classrooms. So I'm just curious if ETHS has any measurement. I know that all of that could not necessarily be included here, but if there is any social emotional measurement, I know that we are still figuring out how to do those measurements in our district, but really thinking about how to broaden how we what we consider as success and achievement, to get a fuller picture of why children feel engaged or disengaged, or families feel engaged or disengaged with the institution.
We don't really. I don't know if we've really figured that out. How do you measure that? And so that's one thing we're grappling with too. We have some pockets where we're trying some different types of surveys and studies out, but we do not have really a good measure for that. And we're still working through that and talking through that and seeing what we have and how does that answer that question. But I don't think it really answers it in a way that's that really captures what that experience is, and it's hard to define. So we're grappling with that too.
But you might add, Carrie, researchers and scholars across the nation are trying to figure that out. It's not like we're ignoring it. It's because it's still an area in which it's in development, and it'll be interesting to see what emerges in the coming years.
That's right. Thank you.
One more. Are you able to, in your data sets, put in geography, where people live? So that you can look at not only who's succeeding or who's not, but where are those pockets coming from? As a feeder organization, not just what middle schools do they go to, but where they go to elementary school, and not just where they go to elementary school, but where they live in this town. Very curious to know, when we have the institutional conversation, where are our students succeeding the most, and within certain pockets, particularly a question around the one ward in our town that doesn't have a neighborhood school, where we know that 100% of those students are bused somewhere. What does the achievement look like, and are we making progress within those pockets? Again, not a question to be answered right now, but more, do you have the capability to include geography as a part of that conversation down the road?
So yes, it would be the answer. By working with Northwestern, I think we have a better ability to do that. It's really a laborious process for us at this point to do reporting by census block or by ward within the school district. But with Northwestern's additional support to do the lift of taking addresses and geocoding them, it's something that we think we would be able to do.
You might be able to simplify it down to buses too.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other questions around the report?
Just a comment. I really appreciate how this generates so many more questions, which then generates so many more demands on data, which then leads into how we're working with our colleagues at Northwestern. And so, as Peter suggested earlier, we have generous support from two foundations to be able to actually dig deep in this work. And so we're really looking forward to that work going forward.
I think that is an excellent pivot then into discussing the work with Northwestern, and to see if there's any questions around that. And before we get to that, I was just wondering if you could, again, go back to repeat it, maybe go back even more to the beginning of what exactly the work is that we're doing with Northwestern, and what the research is that they're going to be doing. And then I think you started to give a little bit of the timeline of what that's going to look like, but if you could go through that again, and then we can open up for questions around that.
Sure. So the grants that we have enable us to work with Northwestern in two important ways. One is to go about creating a series of on-track indicators using middle school and high school data to predict persistence in college. The timeline for that is that we have a data sharing agreement in place and an initial analysis plan that our colleague Lila from Northwestern has developed. And our intent is to get started on the analysis before the end of this calendar year, and ideally to get some sophisticated but preliminary analysis done within this school year, with intent of finalizing it as soon as the beginning of next school year. The purpose of doing that is twofold. One is to create a useful tool that can be used by practitioners as they work with students. The other is really a proof of concept for the two of us and Northwestern to have our colleague at Northwestern learn the structure of our data so that as other research questions come to the fore in the future, that we don't have to go back to square one and learn what kind of data is available, how does it fit together, what are the different ways that it can be worked with. So in the process of doing this project, which has a tangible benefit for both of our districts and for our students, the purpose is also to lay the groundwork for being able to do future research more easily. And so the second half of our work with Northwestern is to create some research agendas, and for the position at Northwestern that has been funded through the grant from the Spencer Foundation, for Lila, the individual in that role, to be able to take our pressing research questions, which we have framed with an equity lens, and identify faculty at Northwestern who would be willing to partner with us on potentially answering some of those questions, whether that be through a qualitative or a quantitative method. Knowing that we, both of our districts are very careful about what primary research we allow in our school setting, and making sure that that has a very high value, a very high return on investment if it's going to take student or teacher time.
And just to underscore the team at the table, and Maria Allison who's sitting there, and Eric and I have been working on this with Dr. David Figlio at Northwestern, and we received 2 grants, one from the Spencer Foundation that also places us in a national partnership of school-university partnerships working on compelling questions of practice. So we'll be part of that network. And the second grant was from the Lewis Sebring Foundation, Chuck Lewis and Penny Sebring and their family, and very committed to building a data infrastructure to actually really dive deep into these sorts of important questions that we have. And we have close to $1 million to be able to actually work on this and build this data infrastructure over the next several years.
So I want to open up to questions from the board around this partnership. I do have a question about, so when we talk about kind of creating this data library almost, is that's existing data that we collect or have the ability to collect, as opposed to thinking about additional data points that we could be collecting, such as some of the social emotional indicators and that sort of thing. Is that correct?
Yes, although I want to, just for those who might be listening, clarify what we mean by library. We're very careful about the way that we share data with researchers, and we want to make sure that the way that we share data with researchers is compliant with both the federal privacy law, FERPA, and the state privacy law, ISRA. So what that means for the purposes of this data sharing agreement is that only those data elements that are necessary to conduct an analysis that we have jointly agreed is for the benefit of our students will we share particular data elements. And so while our Northwestern colleagues are now sort of familiar with, think of it as the table of contents of our data library that we each house within our school districts, they only have access through secured servers for just a few individuals to carry out specific projects, and then they have to destroy the data at the end of the project. And then if another project comes along, we would only share those data elements necessary to conduct that particular project.
Right. Thank you for that clarification. Jonathan?
So by the end of this fiscal year, I think you said, we might have an analysis which gives us the holy grail after all these years. That is the set of indicators that go all the way back to kindergarten about predicting success and persistence in college, right?
Almost. So the caveat there is how far back our data goes, which in District 65 is about 2009. So our initial scope for this project is to look at 6th grade and forward, with the potential to then reach backward based on those 6th grade indicators into elementary school in the future, or to wait until we have some additional data. So our initial scope of work is to have indicators that would go from 6th grade through the end of high school.
I don't mean to sound ungrateful, but we know how important those years before 6th grade are. And it's got to be on our planning board to get to that, to get to those earlier grades.
I agree, and yet there are limitations in the data that we actually have in order to be able to do the analysis. So our initial scope is really bounded by the data that we have available.
Are there any other questions? Well, thank you.
I'm sorry, I had one.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So, we're always trying. We're always looking for that holy grail, right? Like, what is it that's going to get us to those data points or those access points that are going to get our kids, and particularly our Black and Latinx kids, again, to college and career readiness, right? Would it be possible, all right, to work with NERA and look at one, not only just college persistence, also career persistence. As we move into the 21st century, again, there's a lot of careers that don't require a college degree, right? That pay actually more money than college degrees used to. So if we can have maybe mapping out what possible jobs are out there in this 21st century that are going to pay well to for our graduates, kids who graduate from our school systems, and back map, right? And can we also look at successful Latinx and Black Evansonians who've already made it? And again, we have profiles of success in this community. And can we backtrack from those folks and maybe work with the social sciences department at Northwestern to kind of have interviews with folks and talk about what is it that got them to where we want all our kids to be. So something to consider, right?
So I think those are both really good research questions, just to sort of set expectations around what's possible. Part of the reason that we look at college persistence as opposed to sort of a broader measure of post high school success really has to do with the limitations of what data are available, right? So Carrie is pulling from the National Student Clearinghouse, which is a database where colleges and universities, as you may know from across the country, report who's enrolled and when they graduate. So in terms of an initial step of what can we analyze, that database allows us to have sort of a sense of where all students end up. Whereas if we were to go after something like what career did you undertake, we would have to track down graduates and survey them about their experiences. So I think you raise an interesting and good question, but one that would require some primary data collection that has made it such that that's not the initial question that we're going after.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation and for the information. That concludes the Joint Achievement Report and NERA update. I think, right? So we can move on to a report on district equity initiatives and a report on the Courageous Conversation National Summit.
Why don't I start for a moment? And as I said in some of my comments earlier on, in our overall equity work we're doing, and we are very much committed to intensive training across all staff groups and with leadership and our board members as well. We're doing an extensive amount of work on school climate and really paying attention to safety and relationships. We've spent some time on our hiring processes and applying an equity lens to that. And we're spending time and working very closely with our teacher union leadership around building relational trust. And really, if you look at the research literature around relational trust in schools and in classrooms, it will make a difference, and it's sort of obvious with children and with children of color. As it relates to the Courageous Conversations National Summit, as I said earlier, and Suni mentioned as well, we had a significant cohort of folks who were there, and I know in the sessions that I participated in one session that brought board members and superintendents and administrators together to talk about the equity journeys in each of their districts, and it was just fascinating. And as Anya had mentioned in Bellevue, and I know Suni, you had brought up Tukwila, Washington. Washington is moving in accelerated ways. There's some really interesting stuff going on in St. Paul. So we learned a lot just from our fellow districts. I also had an opportunity to sit in an affinity group for superintendents. So this was African American, Hispanic, Latino, and white superintendents who were talking about the challenges and the opportunities of being in leadership roles. And I found that to be really, really interesting. Anya earlier was evoking the compass. There's just the quadrants of thinking and feeling and then getting to acting, and how our fellow colleagues from different school districts are actually working in that regard. And so, again, for me, in the work that we did at the summit, it was a really wonderful opportunity to dig deep and to dig deep with fellow colleagues who I could pick up the phone and start to ask questions. I asked Peter and Ismailis just to give a few reflections from the District 65 side and on sort of observations and things that they heard from colleagues as well.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to acknowledge I'm in my feeling quadrant right now. I've been really reflective and heavy and tired as a woman of color. So, but I'm very proud and thankful for the 43 individuals that participated and took their own personal time, gave their physical and mental, emotional well-being to be at Summit. It's hard work. And I thought, I'm just going to go to this conference. And I came home wiped out. And I'm still recovering. I could say that Summit, and I'm truly thankful for that opportunity. And Summit for me was, I can say, the most transformative experience as a woman of color to date. I thought it was Seed last year, but it has been Summit. It provided a space of healing, building a community with colleagues from ETHS, which is great as we collaborate and move forward. I'm looking forward to that. I will say that for me, I had to look a little bit more at myself and reflect and lean into the things that I thought I knew that I didn't know. So my mission and challenge as I come back is, yes, I want to start rolling with the punches and getting these programs off the ground and really incorporating student voice. I think that is something that is missing. This is personal for me as well. I was one of those students. And so my challenge to myself is to make sure that I show up every single day and that I challenge myself to be in those spaces and listen to perspectives that don't always match my own. So for our brothers and sisters at Opal, I hear you, I see you. And my commitment is to try to respond to that sense of urgency, because I know what that feels like. So that's just my reflection on Summit. I look forward to already going back next year. I'm planning, even if it's out of my own pocket. And I told my mom she's going with me as well. So I want to just turn that over to Peter, and then we can talk about what we have in store for some of our equity initiative updates as we move forward as a district.
Thank you. So I guess I could share on the compass as well. I think it's important as a white person leading this work with Ismailis to just acknowledge how emotional the experience was for me as well, and I think for many of my other white colleagues who were present there. You know, I always am cognizant of the emotional burden that we put on our colleagues of color, that I put on my colleagues of color for my learning. And so I feel a responsibility as a white person to honor that gift of the emotional burden by really doing everything in my power to teach other white people. And so I think for me, a couple of the things I took away from Summit were, further deepening my own learning, recognizing that reflection is a form of action, and that we will, as we seek to act with urgency, continue to need to build in cycles of reflection in order to have this be work that is authentic and that has long-lasting change for our district. So, I sort of renewed my own commitment in the months ahead to continue my own reflection and to encourage colleagues to do the same thing. I think another huge gift from Summit was the relationships that we built among both the District 65 employees who attended and who are now really stepping up together to leadership of equity work in our district together, as well as the invitation that I appreciate and intend to take from our colleagues at 202 to collaborate as equity leaders for the city of Evanston together. So we thought it was helpful, hopefully, to just sort of share our own experiences of Summit as part of the ongoing learning journey that we are engaged in with now several hundred other folks here in District 65.
I know that several board members were also, and Dr. Gorin, we're also at Summit, so I don't know. I want to give an opportunity for us to also share our reflections.
So I could talk about Summit. As many people know, I go every year, so I've attended all except the first one. I missed the first one, but so this is my 8th year, and it is. For me, Summit is a very busy time, and I expect to come back exhausted, physically and emotionally, and I did. Came back and got off the plane, got my luggage, and then headed over to see Ta-Nehisi Coates. And someone said to me when they were talking to me that evening, they said, "You look really like you've just been in a lot of thinking," and I was like, yeah. I felt like my head was spinning. And in addition to the incredible work that's very important, I was feeling the heaviness of the time at Summit. So it's always important, but this year it was huge. And I can't separate that. It's big. I was proud of the fact that for the very first time, there was recognition that equity work begins at the school board table. And so with that, 5 of school board members from District 202 and 4 were there from District 65. So that was really powerful, and it's very true. It's the beginning, and the work is ahead of us, not behind us. And I know a lot of people know that in addition to all that work, I usually do a session, present a session. So this year I did present a session on equity. I guess the way I'd like to put it, my session was about responding to intense opposition regarding equity. And I've experienced that. It was pretty intense. It became national. And so that was powerful. And it's always hard to pull that together at Summit with all the other things going on. And of course, I was thinking, why am I doing a session? And I left there with ideas for next year's session. So I'll run that by, there's some people in this room that I'd like to do. Also, the speakers, the keynote speakers are these are the people who are doing the work nationally and internationally. So we heard some really incredible speakers. And I don't want to spend all the time talking because I know other people went, and I want to hear what impacted you at Summit. I think for me, one of the most important parts of it is just being in an atmosphere where everybody is doing this work in their own way. And it just changes the environment, it changes how people talk to each other, and how folks treat each other. And it's always a little disappointing to leave and come back to the real world. So that's always hard.
So yeah, I'll just say a couple of words. So I always look forward to going to the summit. This was my second time, so after the first time I was like, I want to go back, and it's a personal commitment because it definitely requires you to be bold in being vulnerable and starting with self. And then it also, so for me, since you all started here, I always enter in feelings. It's the Pisces in me, that's where I enter. But I quickly go to action, and just listening and being reflective and hearing the comments from the community, listening to the joint report and all the variables that were tossed your way in terms of, don't forget this, can you look at that? And I get a little, I get in action because I think we know what we know, and we have a lot of information, and we have experts that can go through that information to get to the point of creating some action so we can start moving. And so that's what the summit does for me. So I come back like exhausted like everyone else. But then I kind of come back a little frustrated in that we're constantly talking. I think we talk too much. And I think we have enough information, we have enough data, we know who's not succeeding, we know who's being left behind, we know where they live, we know where the schools don't exist, we know which ones are high income, we know all of that, and we know what happens by chance. And so I'm ready, and I've been ready to say, okay, you know what you know, let's move, let's give the community what they've been asking for, let's be responsible to our kids and make sure that we do everything we absolutely need to do. So Summit puts me in action mode. And so, either you're coming along with us and doing the work, or you're not. And so that's where I'm at, and yes, I always look forward to going back because there's always more learning that I can learn in order to improve my position here. So hopefully next year more will come with us, and also be committed to stay the long journey because it is a process. So
thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to share my experience. Again, it was my first Courageous Conversations. I'm taking seed, and my seed folks here who are doing an incredible job. Thank you, Pat, and thank you, Ismailis. I also thought, like Ismailis, this was, seed really, really had me reflecting in regards to how not only have I been a victim of institutional racism, but also a perpetrator, right? And Courageous Conversations just took it another level. So I thought I was represented well by my colleagues over at the board workshop, at the pre-summit. So I went ahead and did a workshop around special education and ELL, which has always been a conundrum in the education world, right? I know as a lifelong bilingual educator, I have always worked alongside colleagues in special education, and a lot of our processes and the way we do things and we label things is very similar. Again, we have policies and procedures that mimic one another in one, good intentions, but also perpetuating inequity, right? And one thing that really struck me was how when we look at special education by the numbers nationally, many of our black children are disproportionately put or labeled as with emotional behavior disorders, EBD. And they end up being isolated and segregated from the class. Now, the intent of the IDEA, the National Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is to ensure that doesn't happen. But in practice, school systems across the country continue to perpetuate and exacerbate segregation and systemic and institutional racism against black students and other students of color. So that was really, really upsetting. So I was in my feelings. And then, of course, when we talk about bilingual and English language learners, we either under-identify or we just can't figure out which is which, right? Whether it's a language issue or it's and then, of course, we don't ever value both languages. So when we think about two-way immersion programs or bilingual programs, well, they sound great in practice on paper. But if we're not valuing both languages, if we have the opportunity to teach both languages, which again most districts don't do, we primarily measure English language development, then of course, what are we telling our kids? We're telling our kids, well, you're learning both languages, but we really do value English a lot more than Spanish so what do we tell? Again, it's a very explicit message that we send to our families, right? So as we talk about TWE expansion in District 65 and looking at the model of fidelity, I also want to look at implementation. Because again, how are we ensuring not only that we expand the program, but also deliver the program that's beneficial and that values how our Spanish English learners how do we value what they bring and their families bring to what they bring to the table in our district, right? And that I think is my action, right? So as we have these discussions, I really want to look at not only where are we going to put a TWE strand? What are we going to do about ensuring that we have culturally and linguistically appropriate practices for all our kids? And ensuring, and then next year, really looking at inclusion. Looking at Rice Education Center, we'll see if there's any issues there that we need to deal with in regards to emotional behavior disorders. So again, a lot of things that I want to act on now is having had that incredible but very exhausting experience, and I'm still recovering. I had a hard time, again, sleeping sometimes, a couple nights afterwards, because it is just that, it gets you that deep, right? And it's just an incredible experience, and I look forward to going again because it is a journey, like Monique says. So.
Thank you. Pat?
Thanks, Suni. Yes, it was an amazing and very powerful experience. I wish all of us could have gone, and I mean all, in our community, because it really is on so many levels, gives us so much to think about, to feel, and as many people have said, to take into action. And I want to echo something that Peter said, because it really was something I felt too, that as white people, we have a very different experience, and we have a level of freedom to not think about certain things that, as Peter said, many of our friends and colleagues of color have done since the moment they entered the world. And I think really thinking about that and thinking about the history that we don't teach. And I was a history teacher, so I will be I was one of the people who didn't do the job that I should have done. But not only we don't teach it, but we don't unpack what that history has done and what it continues to do. And I think the opportunity to be with, as Pat said, it was just an amazing group of people and a feeling that was so powerful. I wish I could bottle it and bring it back and share it with other people, because it really was powerful. And to hear several particular speakers that, and I'll name them, so if anyone wants to look them up. Debbie Irving and Robin D'Angelo were two amazing speakers, both white women, both educators, both really unpacked so much of how this world is and how it was created and how we can begin to take that journey to change it. And I think, like Monique said, we want to get to that. We really do need to get to that. And I appreciate the comments from the community that I think many of us, all of us, should share that, there is a sense of urgency, and we really need to move forward. And I really appreciate the opportunity to go to Summit, and I really look forward to doing it again, because it truly was transformational for the people there, and hopefully we can bring that back to our community. So thank you.
Thank you. Did you?
Beyond diversity. What a transformative experience. Thank you so much, the leadership, Pat and others who've been working to change the culture in our town. Born and raised in Evanston, and growing up, I knew that something was not right. I knew that. I knew that doors opened for me. I knew some did not open for me that could have opened. So it's been a journey. I took Beyond Diversity 1 in July at Northwestern. And so I always have a takeaway. So my takeaway the first time was the importance of speaking your truth and allowing others to speak their truth. And as we make these decisions, look at indicators, formulate policy, reconfigure curriculum, I think we really, really need to ensure that we listen to the voices of those who we are looking to impact. People will tell you what they need if you listen. The takeaway most recently in Detroit, I realized that as a black man, it is critical for me to continue to articulate and personalize race, thereby using myself as an example and as a story, tell my story, tell my journey. And I really thank my colleagues for helping me to understand, they say it takes a village. Well, my colleagues have helped me to see this. And this is the charge that I have come back with.
Thank you.
So I think I visited all the spaces of the compass in my time at Summit. I usually spend a lot of time in feeling and action, or feeling and thinking. And I think it was really important to explore where believing in action exists in my practice, but possibly I don't emphasize or focus on that enough. I wrote down a number of reflections. They're not terribly cohesive, but since I'm a thinker, I'm trying to figure out how to make it cohesive. First, I'll just say that there's a power in presence. We can't speak our truths or hear truth from one another when we're not in these conversations together. So I think that this elevated the importance of the power of presence. And I just want to state clearly that the next summit is scheduled for October 20th. So that gives everyone the opportunity to make that space on their calendar, and hopefully we can have the power of everyone's presence. In Philadelphia, if that helps. I want to specifically call out some takeaways that I had in different occasions in my opportunity to interact with board colleagues and staff. One, our staff team at District 65 at all levels, the level of passion, honesty, and bravery that was in the room and at the conference, and our representation was palpable. And I think that it's really important to acknowledge that these are folks that are doing this work all the time, but may not have the opportunity to do it together. We don't have the opportunity to see one another and to have these conversations together, and the power in bringing all of us together in a brave space that gives everyone the permission to bring their humanity and speak their truth. I appreciated that. I appreciated Rebecca wasn't able to be here this evening, but her persistent elevation of the need for student voice. I think we've all mentioned it, but her bringing it back to lots of different conversations, how valuable it is when we're talking about stakeholders, that even though our children are young in District 65, that we be creative and we find ways to hear their voices, because they do have something to say if we talk to them and we hear from them in a way that's developmentally appropriate, and that's our challenge to make that happen. I appreciate, as always, Sergio, your willingness to do something different. We were surprised to not see you at the board session, but also I so appreciate the fact that you recognize the value in being in a different session and being able to bring that learning back to our board conversation as well. And I wish we could have been in all spaces. There were so many spaces to be in, and so I appreciated that. And SUNY and our opportunities to talk about implementation. I think, SUNY, you're a very humble person, and so I think that a lot of times, you speak in a very practical way, not realizing that you may be saying something powerful. And I think a lot of your ideas about implementation were thought of as incredibly innovative and creative and exciting. And inspired other people in other districts to think about what they could be doing. And so I appreciated the power of the presence and the different opportunities that we had. I also say that it was an experience, a lived experience in the power of culturally relevant opportunities for children. That safe space. Part of that is having opportunities for different stories, different experiences, different cultural expressions to be centered. We had keynote speakers that were from a variety of different backgrounds. We had, and I didn't get to stay for some of them because I had to leave on Monday, which I was really sad, but I have 2 small children. They were very happy for me to be home, including my husband. But the power in having folks who are centering other ways of thinking outside of a Eurocentric way of viewing the world, which we are steeped in constantly, and that validation and being able to be exposed to representations of my heritage, people using the vernacular that I grew up with, people loving one another in the way that I understand loving, but also seeing that from different ways of being in the world as well, and having all of that elevated in a way that was respectful and connecting. So, being able to experience that as adults is a reminder of how powerful that is for our children and families. I think I was also reminded at the amount of support that we have in our city, and the reality that there's confusion and there's opposition as well. And remembering that this work requires us all telling our truths, and the compass helps us come from different perspectives and hear each other's truths in a way that will be productive and empathetic to the experiences that people are having. I was reminded at the fact that this work is like a 3-legged stool. And that stool can be off balance. That stool can experience disequilibrium if we don't have all of those legs and support. So we need to have a governance and policy body that understands and values equity. We need to have a district as an institution in practice that values and understands equity. And we need to support our community in the equity values that they have, right, and that are expressed in many different ways. And so how are we providing these opportunities to parents and to community organizations writ large so that they can use the same language and have the same powerful experiences that we're having? So that was something that came in my thinking and acting stages. I also considered the learnings that we have in our district in terms of support and seeing how other staffing structures are set up. Why don't we have a director of Black student achievement? If we know that this is an issue, where is the strategic structure in place to help us think about that? How have we considered how we use our resources? And I think lastly, the fact that all of these conversations are happening in a very weighty time. November 8th was one of the most profound experiences that I ever had as a woman of color in this country. I was not surprised, but I felt broken. As someone who follows politics, as someone who follows policy and understands the power of that, and someone who has to raise small children in these times ahead, and knowing that millions of people in our country voted. They may not have felt like they were voting through a racial lens, but they voted in the absence of a racial lens, at the very minimum, in a way that was incredibly harmful to many, many people in our country, that was terrifying to many, many people in our country. And as I watch the policies that are rolling out that suggest that police reform is not necessary, when we know that there are certain communities that feel like they are being harmed or their lives are being taken with impunity, when we see policies being developed to ban people based on how they choose to worship, when we see people being not held accountable for how they talk to grieving widows, and arguing with a grieving widow can be considered patriotic. However, kneeling in reverence and reflection in regards to where our country is not progressed and how people of color are treated, and that being considered unpatriotic, it feels threatening. It feels worrying. And so participation in Summit was heavy with the reality that we're doing this work in a national environment that does not seem to have a universal agreement on the value of the difference in our humanity. And understanding that when I sit at this table and I think about all of my neighbors and all of my friends and all of the people that I know and don't know in this community of different backgrounds and how they're able to bring their full humanity to our district and be appreciated and feel welcome and feel like they can love and connect with each other long term. But I also think of myself and my children and what lies before them, and how we fortify the people that we care about in this city, in this national climate. So that is why I was all over the compass. But that is also the power in taking time to go to a summit that is specifically about being self-reflective and also being in community with other people around issues of equity. It's an opportunity for us to experience our own humanity and to be connected with each other's humanity.
Thank you. I hesitate to see who wants to follow up with that, but Mark, you can take that.
Yeah, I don't really want to follow that. Anya, thank you for sharing that with us. It's profound. I've been sitting here thinking about what I might say about some. This is my fifth, and as with all the previous four, I came home exhausted and but feeling good, feeling really good about the work that's going on. And during the meeting, as I always am, I was reminded of a quote that I read in some of the work we were doing when I first got involved in this work. I think it was 2009, and Pat helped me source this because I couldn't remember who said it, but I was reminded again tonight when I heard the folks from Opal calling for urgency. And that the quote goes something like this, that we already know everything we need to know to educate every child in this country to his or her fullest ability. What we lack is the will. Now here, I'm frustrated by, as many of us have expressed tonight, that we want to go faster, we want this to happen. But at the same time, I'm encouraged and honored to be in a community and on a board and with a partner board who is showing leadership. And what I experienced in Detroit showed me that we are providing leadership on a national basis. We're fortunate in many ways. We're ahead of where other districts are. We were there with a lot of people from both boards, a lot of people from both districts. I talked to many people who were there alone, who are coming from their district from across the country, who are fighting this fight by themselves, literally one person on a board or one person in an administration trying to fight this fight and having very few allies, very little support, and very little or less leadership. And it made me feel very fortunate to be part of this district where we are showing leadership. That said, I'm reminded of something I told Dr. Witherspoon way back, probably around 2009 or so, 2010, when big changes were happening, and I said, you're like the captain of an oil tanker, and you've ordered a new course, and the helmsman is spinning the wheel of the ship. But just because you're turning the wheel doesn't mean that boat's going to be on a new course anytime soon. You're going to be well down the coast before you've corrected your course. And I think that's true. I think it takes time. It's because we're dealing with culture change. And we're dealing with culture change within these institutions that we serve. We're dealing with culture change in our community at every level. And it's slow, hard work. And we have to just be relentless in our persistence. But I think we're doing that. And the encouraging part is that I think it's starting to show some results. I mean, I see it. I feel the culture changing in our building for sure. And I sense you're seeing some of the same things in your buildings as well. It's a very different place than when any of my 3 children went there. Very different. And we are changing the culture. So, I'm encouraged by all these things. On a personal level, when I go there, I find myself, partly because of the protocol that we stay in, and partly because I'm really trying to get in touch with it, is starting everything I say with, well, as a white guy who grew up in the 50s and 60s, and then I make my point. And if you unpack that, it tells you a lot. It tells the person I'm talking to a lot about who I am and what my perspective is. But at the same time, it reminds me that that's my perspective, and that it is pretty narrow, and that it's only one perspective, and that everybody else's perspective matters just as much. It doesn't have, I don't have to dominate that thinking around whatever topic is on the table. That's a big thing to take away for a white guy who grew up in the 50s and 60s. I got to tell you, that's huge. So once again, you know, it's a path. We're all on this journey together, and we're all on it individually. And you know, wherever you are, you know, it's incumbent upon us. We are obliged to keep going down that road, as straight down that road, and as honestly as we possibly can. And we'll get there. So, yeah, I understand the call for urgency, and I want that urgency badly. I can taste it. I want things to start happening, but at the same time, I know that change has to happen in a certain order over a certain time frame. And the best we can do is keep the pedal on the floor, and then it'll happen. So I had a wonderful experience, and I will forever be grateful from my colleagues that I spent time there with. I learned so much from all of you every time, so thank you.
Thank you. I'll just add to that, because I think I shared, this was my second summit. Last year was a powerful experience, and this year was no less powerful. I think the sessions I attended, so for me it was, getting to go deeper into my personal journey around my racial identity and my role in this work, and using the protocol, I think, was incredibly valuable. I think also the sessions that I attended, which did speak a lot to incorporating student voice, which I agree with the comments around that have already come up. That is something, while we need to be intentional about how we include other voices into our decision making, I think we can't. And I think it's easy for us as a K-8 district to dismiss the student voice, but I think that's a mistake. And there was a district, a K-12 district, that was able to show how they incorporated student voice from K-12 into their policy making, and that was really powerful. I think too, I too felt the sense of community and being able to be in a community of people who are engaged in this work, either with support or alone in their districts. And I heard too from from colleagues from our district who went there, who felt that sense of power and trying to understand how can we recreate that here. And I think that's a call for us in terms of action that we can take, is figuring out how we can provide space to continue for people who went to Summit, who've been through Beyond Diversity, to have time and space to collaborate, to meet, and to continue this conversation, and to continue figuring out our own role in this. One thing, Rebecca Mendoza couldn't be here tonight, but she did provide some of her own reflections, most of which I think has been stated already. But one thing in particular that she took away from our board session that I think was really accurate and powerful, and so I just want to read what she presented, is on how do we define race. I know this sounds rudimentary, but upon further exploration, I don't think we as a district have a uniform understanding of race, nor do I think our families understand enrollment forms and how that impacts the data we collect. A few examples I can think of that we aren't accurately capturing is that of Afro-Latinos, who would more than likely select Black African American, or Latinos who might select white, or many who select other to avoid the questions altogether. Given that so much of our conversations that revolve around student achievement involve race, I think it would be worthwhile to come up with a district definition of race. A powerful quote worth sharing: "Data is a mirror through which our truer self is revealed. Intentional, honest, unapologetic conversations about racial disparity in education and across each sector of our society allows us to reflect upon and act in truth toward becoming our better self." I thought that was a powerful takeaway as well, that I think is something that we can further discuss. The only other thing that I want to mention that, and I don't know if everyone had the opportunity to see Passing, the one-act play that was presented. And I will admit that originally I wasn't planning on going to see it, but then I decided to do it after hearing people talking about it, and I'm so glad I did. It's a play, a one-woman play that relates the true story of a light-skinned Black woman who, and her light-skinned Black brother, she chooses to live her life as a Black woman while her brother chooses to pass. The play was powerful, the conversation afterwards was powerful, and I think it got me a lot to thinking, and then even having conversations with colleagues afterwards about how do our staff of color pass in order to achieve the success that they've succeeded, which then leads me to think about how do we ask our students to pass every day in order to achieve our definition of success. And I think, the comments, Anya, that you made earlier about, asking 3-year-olds to code switch. I mean, I think that's kind of the feelings and thoughts that I had after seeing that. So I think that was really powerful. It makes me even think more about how student voice is so important, and understanding how students are experiencing our institution is really important. So that is my addition. There was a lot of feeling for me this time around, where I think my first summit, I was in thinking mode and wanting to just act. And I'm still, that's my where I naturally like to sit, but I'm trying to learn to be in feeling more so that we can, because I think that's where we get the listening and the learning from. So that's what I have to say.
If I may, if I can add one more thing. I, too, like many people, got off the plane and went off to the high school to see Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I want to just salute Marcus Campbell, who led a community conversation, and for somebody who's white and somebody who's a civic participant, to be able to deeply engage in a dialogue and to watch you work with the guest author. It was a stunning moment. It was an exhausting moment too, because it was just coming off. But I just want to salute both the preparation, but the way you facilitated and welcomed a community conversation that is needed and that still resonates in my brain. So thank you very much.
Marcus.
Now you're exhausted.
That's why we're keeping it cold in here, so everybody's. Apologies for that, by the way.
Is there an opportunity for questions for those of us who didn't get to have the experience? I just was wondering, because Paul, when you first started talking about, the districts that are have the best outcomes, have, the deepest and probably broadest leadership. And so could you expand on that a little bit? Like I totally get the premise, but what did those districts look like? What were those outcomes that they were achieving? We know that there are various things that need to happen to get to the end game. But we're national leaders, right? But what were other districts talking about as how they're measuring their progress? What are those, as we've been talking a lot about miles, just guideposts, things. So if anybody can share things that they took away from the discussions with other boards or other leadership, school district leadership about that, I'd be very interested.
Well, I mentioned earlier Bellevue, Washington, that actually asked their students from K through 12, I believe. They do a survey, and they ask their students about their racialized experience in their classroom and in their school, and their connections with their peers. And I think that that's really key data for the social and emotional experience that those children are having in their district and their ability to access the curriculum. They also ask the students about how culturally relevant they feel like the curriculum is. That means also having a conversation with children about what cultural relevance is, having conversations with children about what fairness is, what justice is, what difference is. And so I think these things feed into one another. But that's one of the districts that I spoke with that was not only measuring success, but also looking at broadening how they qualify success and achievement in their education of children as well.
So were they seeing that if they doing it over time, that by the process of doing it, there was more comfort, and just looking at the progression of the actual metric, or have they been doing it a long time that they could, or some amount of time that they could see how the impact of literally doing that activity, as well as all the other work that's happening, was having an improved feeling of safety and identity, and the types of things that we're looking for?
Well, there's opportunity to be in touch with them about what their longitudinal experience is, right? So in that moment, we didn't have an opportunity to talk about what their longitudinal experience is, but I think that the district deciding that they prioritize hearing that information from children also impacts how the culture and climate of the experience that children are having is evaluated and is altered or course corrected when there are mistakes. I'll say also that, I can't remember which school district in Minnesota it was, but they actually have a racial lens that they utilize for evaluation of curriculum and instruction. And I thought that that was also a really powerful statement in terms of what they value. And also, if you're going to evaluate people, you also need to provide that kind of professional development and ongoing support. And so how that gets embedded in the institution, that value for taking a look at what is the experience of equity in the classroom, but also in the work that's happening in order to develop professional development and curriculum, et cetera. So just putting some institutional measurement there.
I wanted to share also, so in regards to students with who are labeled emotionally and behaviorally disturbed, St. Paul, Minnesota, which does a lot of cutting-edge work around equity, the person that's in charge of doing some of that, we were focused on those students, right, who are predominantly, black students, and was able to provide professional development for teachers in regards to co-teaching and inclusion. So making sure that so again, special education is supposed to be a temporary place to be in, and then you're supposed to get whatever helps and supports you can get so you can get back into the general education classroom. So I don't have the specific metrics, but I know they were at about 80% of kids who were in EBD back in like 2013. Again, after all the supports, after the professional development with teachers, after they learned about co-teaching and inclusion, I think the latest metric that they got is that only 20 or 30% of kids are now labeled EBD. So there was a huge reduction in blacks and in children of color being labeled as EBD, because again there was proper training and supports to actually support teachers in regards to inclusion and getting them back into the general education setting.
And I just might add, sometimes we don't have to go out to Washington State. ETHS has been featured in some national journals, on the PBS NewsHour, at national conferences. I think Dr. Bavis would be glad to give you a little short bibliography of things that have been published about what we have been able to do.
I've watched and seen those.
But I think to support what Eric is saying, what we heard, or what I heard, just sitting around the lunch table and the breakfast table, is that when everyone from leadership all the way down to your teachers are committed to the work of equity, conversations are different solutions are more innovative, and the lens is more inclusive. But it's real basic. And then you get down to the metrics and the measurements, but leadership starts at the very top, and it has to be infused, and everyone has to definitely be on the same page when it comes to the reason and the impact that addressing equity issues bring. So the communities, the states, the districts that were all in were the most successful. Those that were there by themselves were highly challenged, and so that's where you got the results. So it was real basic, and then we got to how does this translate, or what results have you seen? But if everybody's all on board, then the conversation changes. Right.
And that was the theme of the session I went to, which was building a critical mass of champions across the system. So yes, the leadership, yes, the board, but yes, the principals, yes, the curricular leads as well. And that's obvious, but it's really interesting when you meet colleagues who are actually doing that work. The other thing, along with our colleagues and the resources that we have and the great partnerships with the high school, there's colleagues over at 219 and Niles who are doing some pretty interesting stuff on instructional rounds and where instruction intersects with the equity agenda. And so that's some place that we can tap into as well. I know you guys are tapping into it as well through other resources around the country. So again, the opportunities to think and learn from others and to build momentum was just alive at the conference.
I think at the end of the day, each district has to decide what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And it's based on the needs of the district. So, it's helpful to hear stories about what other districts are doing. And, I've met folks at Summit. Every session has somebody in it from Portland.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
That's true.
Every session, there was somebody from Portland.
St. Louis
For
Park.
years,
Right.
yes, they send a ton of folks. But, so that's really helpful to know that they send people from at all different levels. But like Monique said, we have to really think about who's at the table and what our discussions are, and make sure that when we talk about every aspect of our district, we think about equity first. And if we start there, then we'll be able to identify what we need to do. And that's what we've tried to do at the high school, and we're not saying that we have all the answers. We know we've been at it for a longer period of time, and we think about equity first. We think about where our weakest links are, and that's how we decide what we're going to do. So I think you have to think very individually as a district, how to think about this in a practical way. Yes, you get ideas from other districts, but there's no formula, there's no 12-step. Unfortunately, wouldn't that be nice if we could just say, here it is? And so that's what makes it complex. And when we talk about adaptive leadership, that squiggly line, for those of you who've done Beyond Diversity, we have to stay in adaptive leadership. That means that a lot of people work on the same problem for a long period of time and keep a level of discomfort because it's going to be hard. And so you have to have lots of minds thinking about solutions.
And I think to the point of how to think about equity first, always. One thing that we've talked on our board a lot about is using a formal racial equity impact assessment tool. And we've looked at one from Race Forward. The Tukwila School District, which is a small school district out of Seattle, they did one of the presentations that I went to, and they've adapted their own equity assessment tool, which I thought, and they shared it with us, so I shared it with Dr. Gordon, and I can share it with the rest of our board. But what was interesting about their use of the tool is that it actually included a rubric for them to actually look at how they're using the tool. So that, I think, is also something that we can do to help us. While I agree there is no, 12-step blueprint, I do think there are some concrete steps that we can take to help us all learn to develop a similar equity lens and then put it into practice so that it just becomes then a habit as we, for our institution, as we continue down the road.
And I just wanted to call out why, for anyone who is questioning why that's really important. It's not that different, for example, than how we teach children to read. If we look at guided reading principles of instruction, it starts out with shared reading. It moves on to guided instruction, moves on to, I can't remember the next one, sorry, it's been a few years. But the point is that there is intentional practice at the beginning, and it's very explicitly stated. And as institutions, institutions of learning, we're very well practiced in using certain data points and using certain vocabulary and certain ways of thinking of success in our practice. And as a result, if we look at our data, we see that as an institution, we've systematically left out certain voices and certain perspectives on what is success and what is learning, and what is opportunity and how do folks access opportunity. And so using an equity impact assessment tool is practice for us. It's allowing us to develop an equity lens through explicit practice with one another, allowing us to have conversations and understandings and misunderstandings with one another in an explicit way. That is the beginning of our learning as an institution, about how to apply an equity lens to our work. And so we can have that value in our heart, just like we have children who are who are pre-literate and they're ready to learn. But that does not mean that they are not going to need a very formal and guided practice that's responsive to their readiness and to where they are in the world. And so I think it's really important when, I think for some folks, they think about equity and they think that somehow they're going to be missing from the conversation. And I think it's really important to call out that we actually know as an institution how to include certain voices and perspective, and we do it very naturally and easily, regardless of our background, because everyone who's here around the table is here because we figured out how to do that. But we need to practice how to bring that equity lens, and that's where this kind of tool, or the way 202 approaches it, as I think you all talk about value-based decision-making. However that tool is, it's really important for institutions to do that explicitly in order to make it more automatic later.
I don't know if there was anything additional, Peter and Ismailis, that you wanted to add?
I don't think so. I mean, we will have an opportunity on the 6th of November to discuss some of our next steps in terms of aligning our strategic plan with some of the recommendations that came in our consultants report from last fall. And we'll continue to have on a quarterly basis a reporting of our progress on our strategic plan and on our equity work, which we've been working as a staff to bring closer and closer together so that we don't have a strategic plan and an equity agenda. We have our equity strategic agenda.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for sharing about the experience. And I too am looking forward to next year already. With that, we will move on to review of federal and state legislative developments. Gretchen, is that you?
It's the hour is late, so I'm going to do a speed update, which is simply going to highlight the new Illinois school funding formula. I have previously circulated links to the Illinois Association of School Boards, helpful summaries, and the Advance Illinois' slightly different but similarly helpful summaries of the legislation. I shared that Lisa shared that with the city school committee and with our own school board. So if you haven't seen that and you need to lay your hands on it, let me know. I'm also going to refer you to the Franzik Radelet, our attorney's really, really helpful summary that came in an email from them. Hopefully you're all signed up for their email newsletter. And that came on October 11th if you want to dig back through your emails. But you know, here's I'm going to highlight like 4 or 5 very quick things. Number one, it imposes an evidence-based funding model on the way we distribute state dollars. The idea being that the districts most in need get new money first. I want to highlight the role that EdRed played in developing that evidence-based funding formula. They were really the architects in partnership with a number of other regional and statewide organizations. So it's not a perfect formula, but I think there's no question it's an improvement over what existed before. As you may recall, the governor vetoed a huge chunk of the bill, but that found its way back, including a hold harmless provision, a block grant for CPS, a regionalization factor, and a few other items. One of the big compromises to ensure enactment that came up during the EdRed lunch of a little while ago, Candace was there, the CFOs from both of our districts were there, I think, is the $75 million in tax credits for people who donate to private school scholarships. I'm sure we all have an opinion on that one. We'll leave it at that. It wasn't well received at the EdRed lunch. I will say that. There was a Republican legislator there who attempted to justify that as the reasonable exchange for the elimination of the property tax freeze. There is a provision in the new bill to allow a referendum, a voter referendum, to reduce tax levy. That has some important conditions that need to be met. It's arguably a redundant kind of provision because our communities do elect their school boards to establish things like that. There's a provision for a committee to review TIF districts. There is certain very, very limited mandate relief. And I lastly, would highlight one really important provision of the bill, and that is if any little piece of it is struck down, and there are some possible threatened lawsuits, Teachers Union in Chicago has come out saying they may file. If any piece of the legislation is struck down, the entire law fails. So it'll be starting right back over again. So that was the big news, and I hope that was a quick summary. Sorry, I don't think it went on too long.
One more thing to that?
Yes, please.
Applies to us.
Jump in.
Because we are in high demand and fairly high growth districts. So the hold harmless that was applied for
I know where you're going with this, and thank you.
Us keeping the money that we do get currently, not that it's much for either of our districts, but that portion that we do get per pupil, that hold harmless clause, if your population grows over time, the money will not grow. So, you know, if we would continue to grow at the pace in District 65 and 202, at the pace that we have been growing, those monies will still remain the same. They don't grow along with the population. So it's just good to understand that for districts that are, you know, high value, high demand districts that are seeing growth in population, we won't receive commensurate money from the state for that.
That is correct. And it should go without saying that neither one of our districts are likely to see much more new money in this evidence-based funding formula.
New money, but not even.
Yeah, and the hold harmless has that shrinking effect that Candace has pointed out.
And then at the federal level, just one worry that we'll just leave for us to ruminate on and think about what we want to do. And it really goes to Anya's earlier poignant commentary about where we are as a country. I have a worry, I think we can share this, that eventually, she's actually already doing it, the Secretary of Education is going to start to pull back from administrative rules and regulations subtly, because the administration writ large is at a logjam, and so we may not see the great and wonderful laws, but we're going to see pulling back. And I think we have to be really keen as leaders and as policy wonks to pay attention to what's going on in DC. And she's starting to do some stuff in special education. There's just things that we have to be really poised to be on our toes.
Title IX.
Civil rights.
And civil rights, right. So I just, I think we know that, but it's worth saying that, and then it's worth being proactive, and obviously we can call Jen Schakowsky and our senators and work hard that way. But I think it's going to be really imperative that we stand tall for the rights of our children, and that we help support our federal legislators in this as well.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, then we will move on to District 202 action items.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so our first action item is our consent agenda, which includes the treasurer's report from August 2017, approval of bills, personnel agenda, which is appointments to staff exempt, support staff in nutrition services, change in status, which includes stipends, and resignation, exempt and support staff.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Yes.
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 Yes. Okay, that's all we have.
All right, thank you. And then we have our District 65 action items. Sergio, you want to take that motion?
I move that the Board of Education accept the recommendations outlined in the attached group motion and approve the personnel appointments, leaves, and separations, superintendent goals, September 2017 Board of Education meeting minutes, destruction of September 2015 closed session audio recordings, and gift acceptance to Nichols and Dewey.
Second.
Do we need to
The-
specifically say
as amended?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right.
So I move the Board of Education accept the recommendation outlined in the attached group motion and approve the superintendent goals as amended.
So now, do we have a second for that?
Second.
Okay. Roll call, please.
Cohen?
Yes.
Hiltner?
Yes.
Chow?
Yes.
Tanya Vudi?
Yes.
Hernandez?
Yes.
Cartha?
Yes. Motion carries. And then do you want to adjourn?
Yes, so District 202 adjourns at 9:59.
And with no further business to come before the board, this meeting is adjourned at 10 p.m. Thank you very much, everyone.